chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we'll be looking at verses 2 through 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. Better to go to the house of mourning than go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and living will take it to the heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth.
As we continue our series on Jesus is my friend, and today we look at Jesus is my friend because he understands me when I'm sad. Jesus understands me. We talked about Jesus understands me when I'm tempted. Jesus understands me when I'm lonely. Jesus understands me when I'm tired. Today, Jesus understands me when I am sad. Two verses. Two shortest verses in the English Bible. 1 Thessalonians 5:16. Two words. Rejoice always. John 11:35. Jesus wept. Wait a minute. How do you do both of those? How do you rejoice always and then cry sometimes? Was Jesus disobeying the principle in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 16, when he cried in John 11:35? Can rejoicing people weep? And so what we'll be looking at is the biblical teaching about grief and sorrow. Is it, don't worry, be happy, as the song said years ago? Well, the best example we can find for living life and obeying God is in Jesus himself. Let's look at Matthew 26, verses 36 through 38. They've had the Lord's Supper, and now in their Garden of Gethsemane. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Wow. John 11:35 is just a summary of what Jesus experienced and communicated in Matthew 26. And then we look at Luke 22, verse 44. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. So Jesus was someone who was able to experience deep emotion in sorrow, and grief, and dread, anticipation of pain, and the separation from his Father. I think somebody who helps us understand the combining of these two is Peter. 1 Peter 1, verses 3 through 6. Here's what Peter says. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time." Wow, he says you have a great hope. And it's a hope that will not rust, it won't rot, it won't wilt, and nobody's going to take it away from you. Boy, those must be happy people. Yeah, they have a great hope. But then verse 6 says, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you have been grieved by various trials. You mean you can be grieved while you're rejoicing? Absolutely. And one of the things that sustains us through our grief and disappointment is our living hope that won't rust, won't rot, won't wither, and nobody's going to take it away from. But he said, you may need to cry a little while right now. You have been grieved by various trials. So ask the question, what's better, a funeral or a party? Ecclesiastes 7, 2 through 4. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men. The living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Which is better, a funeral or a party? Is it wrong to laugh? Absolutely not. Proverbs 17:22. It's better to laugh. It's a great blessing to be able to laugh. And so, there's nothing wrong with laughing. Perhaps Christ summed it well in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Solomon said in Proverbs 17:22, a merry heart is good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. So there's a time to laugh, and it's good for you to do that. But he said if you want to look at which is both of them okay at the appropriate times, but if you know really which is the lasting benefit, it's better to go to a funeral than to go to a party. We can enjoy ourselves and relieve stress by going to a party. But if you go to a funeral and really think about it, what I do when I go to a funeral, every time I go to a funeral, and I use this passage in most funerals that I preach. I've preached hundreds of funerals and attended thousands of funerals, but one day, if the Lord doesn't come, I'll attend a funeral different from every funeral I've ever attended before, because I'll be the man in the box. And I'm going to be talking at that funeral. Hebrews 11:4, Abel, though he is dead, still speaks, and whoever's in that casket will talk as long as people have memories of them in their life. And you know what they're going to remember? What I did, what I said, how I treated people. And the great thing about the live folks at a funeral, we still have time to change the speech that people will be giving about us. So if I need to adjust that a little bit, I still got a little bit of time. So folks can say good things and be telling the truth about it. So, ask the question, how can Jesus understand me when I'm sad? Well, that's who he was. We often read this at the Lord's table. Isaiah 53, verses 3 and 4. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. The prophet Isaiah looked hundreds of years into the future when the Messiah would come, and he said, here's the kind of fellow he's going to be. He's going to be a crying man. He's going to be a grieving person because folks are going to hurt him and they're going to reject him. And so, as we often sing, Jesus knows all about our troubles. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. Jesus is my friend because he understands me when I'm sad. Luke chapter 19. Beginning with verse 41. Now as he drew near, that was near the city of Jerusalem, as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you especially, in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave you in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. He's looking ahead to AD 70, when Romans will surround the city of Jerusalem and literally wipe them out. If you only knew. If you only knew. And he just wept when he thought about the pain and sorrow they were going to experience. We see him in John chapter 11, verses 3 and following. Jesus was good friends with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Verse 3, therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Verse 11, he said, our friend Lazarus sleeps, and I go that I may wake him up. And the word friend there means somebody that he liked. And so that's the kind of love that means joy in the presence of, not the kind that is commanded by love your enemies and love your wife and love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. That is a command, and there's no emotion in that command. That means I treat people right regardless of how I feel. The word that he used for friend here was somebody that Jesus liked. And so in verse 11 is interesting. Well, 6 and then 11. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. What in the world's going on? What you usually do when you get a call and say the person that you love is sick and they may not make it, you better get a plane and get here as fast as you can. And Jesus didn't get a plane, but he could have started walking, and he said, no, let's just hang around a couple more days. Which means Jesus does not do all we want him to do, nor does he come when we tell him it's time to come. He comes when he gets ready. Verse 11, these things he said after he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then the disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. See, Jesus had a plan. So he eventually gets there. Verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that he'd already been in a tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went out and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said, yes, Lord. I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So, first sister, Lord, if you've been here, you're late. Why didn't you get here earlier? Verse 28, and when she had said these things, she went away and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, "The teacher is come and is calling for you." As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforted her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, "She's going to the tomb to weep there." Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." That's what her sister said. Same thing. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." And some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?" And then in the following verses, he goes out to the tomb and says, "Lazarus, come forth." Jesus does not always come when we want him to come. We have questions that we do not have answers, and other people do too. But Jesus understands us. Notice Jesus understanding the apostles. Let's go back to those two verses that we read. Matthew 26, verse 40 and 41. He told Peter, James, and John, the ones that he took a little further in the garden. He went out and prayed, "O my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" Is he mad? Is he going to fire them and say, "I need to get 3 more before I die, and that's going to happen in a few years. I'm ashamed of y'all"? No, he said, "Watch and pray that lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus understands when we know better and want to do better than what we actually do. I know that you're willing, but the flesh is weak. And it's even more defined in Luke 22:45. When he arose from prayer, he had come to his disciples. He found them sleeping from sorrow. How did he know that? He was pretty smart. John 2 said he did not testify. He had no need that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. Jesus can read our minds. And he knew they were sleeping from sorrow, not from indifference, not from any other foul motive. Some people, when they're in grief, sleep a lot. And some people can't sleep hardly any. And Jesus understands that. So how does he know that? Well, he experienced some of that. Go back to verse 44 that we read a few minutes ago. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Jesus understood the power of sorrow. Stephen Covey, who was very powerful in business training and education, wrote about the 7 habits of highly effective leaders. And he told one day he was riding a train, a subway. I think it was in New York City. But he was riding this, and there was a man with 3 children. And they were wild. They were running all over the place and stomping and kicking and hollering. And just went on and on and on and on, and he got real uncomfortable, and he couldn't understand what in the world was the matter with this man. Why don't he get those kids under control? And finally, he just couldn't contain it or didn't contain it any longer. He said, "Sir, you think you might ought to be watching your children?" Man said, "Yeah, I guess so." He said, "We've just come from the hospital where my wife, their mother, died an hour ago, and I don't know what I'm doing." And he said his attitude immediately changed toward that man. And now his attitude, what can I do to help? Jesus knows all about our troubles. He will guide till the day is done. There's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. And so what we're doing in this series, I want to appreciate better Jesus as my friend. I want to be a friend to others as Jesus is a friend to me, and I want to be able to tell others about my friend. So how can I be a friend to others in their grief? How can I help others who are experiencing loss? Number one, show up. Well, what am I going to say? That's not near as important as showing up. I'm embarrassed, but I did it, or I didn't do it. I had a friend a couple of grades lower than me in high school. Here we are, junior, senior in high school, and I hear that her daddy died. He was in Nashville and just, pow, died right there. And I had time, and I was close enough. Centerville, Tennessee, you're not far from anything there. And I could have gone to the funeral and just showed up and said, "Barber, I'm really sorry," but I didn't know what to say. It scared me. What if my daddy dies? See, I got all that stuff, and you know what I did? Nothing. Nothing. That's what some people do. When friends have trouble, they do nothing. So the best thing we can do is to show up. Well, what do you say? Well, a lot of things you don't say. If it's a child, don't say, "God needs another flower to pick from his garden and put his garden in heaven." You don't tell kids that about their mothers. Don't try to explain it. Don't try to fix it. Just show up. Bill MacDonald suggests these words: sorry about your loss. It's hard to mess that one up. Sorry about your loss. Well, how am I going to explain it? Don't need to explain it, because any way you or I explain it's not going to help. Just sorry about your loss. And then if you have some complimentary and interesting and maybe even humorous or serious stories on how this person positively impacted your life or the life of others, that would be appropriate. But if you don't know anything else, show up, sorry about your loss. And then look for ways to be of service. Do something helpful. Don't say, "What can I do?" They ain't got the slightest idea. They're in shock. They don't know what to tell you. Just try to find something and do it. I was told about my friend David Swanner. The church in Pulaski, Tennessee, where he preached for several years, they wanted to reach more into the community. And the way we usually reach into the community, we want to tell you, "You're wrong here, you're wrong here, you're wrong here, you're wrong here." Well, there is a time to tell people how to do better than what they're doing, but it might be good to develop some trust before we do that. And so they did what you have started doing. They got a freezer, and they started putting desserts in the freezer, and the two local funeral homes called them and said, "We have somebody in the funeral home." And they would take one of those desserts out of the freezer and take it to the funeral home. Sharing the love of Christ, 2nd Street Church of Christ, Pulaski, Tennessee. They made this arrangement. They would go and get permission. They'd show up the night before the funeral. They had all their equipment in vans, and they would wash the cars of the immediate family the night before the funeral. They just showed up, did it. One of the most interesting stories I ever read in Reader's Digest. This family had had a loss, and the night before the funeral, somebody came up, knocked. Sorry about your loss. I'd like to have everybody's shoes, please. And had a basket there. They said, what for? I said, I'd just like to have your shoes. And so they took all the shoes over next door to their house, and they gave a real good shoe shine to every pair of shoes in the family. If you know that somebody's coming, could I pick your folks up at the airport? Could I keep someone in my home? Could I take care of your pets? Here's a casserole. Just find something and do it is one of the things we can do. And then what is good to do, and it becomes difficult, but it's good to do, is weeks and months after the loss. Remember the person or the event and mention it. A lot of people are afraid to do it. Well, I don't remind them. You're not reminding them of anything. If they've had a serious loss in their life, they think about it every day and probably every hour of every day. And one of the things that people tell me that is painful is that people dodge it and they think that the person has disappeared. No, no, no. Dead people still talk. They're still around in the lives and minds of those who have loved them. Let me share with you two of the best books that I've read on grief. Number one is Good Grief by Granger Westberg. This is over 50 years old. I don't know if it tells when it was first printed. Looks like 1962. So it's been around a while. Granger Westberg, in this book, tells about the stages of grief, what goes on. We're in a state of shock. We express emotion. We feel depressed and very lonely. We may experience physical symptoms of distress. We may become panicky. We feel a sense of guilt after the loss. We're filled with anger and resentment. We resist returning. Gradually, hope comes through, and we struggle to affirm reality. Essentially, what he's saying is, if you're experiencing some of these things, you are normal. You're not losing your mind or your faith. You are normal. This is what happens when people have severe losses. And so I've given away hundreds of these. And a lot of times I like to do it months after the loss to let them know that I'm still thinking of them. Two of my favorite mustard seeds out of Good Grief is this. Number one, Mr. Westberg says, think back to a time when it was overcast for days and days. I remember a day a few years ago in January, for 2 weeks we did not see the sun. It was just low, dark clouds. And you know, after about a week and a half, it's the sun. I remember something about that, but I don't remember exactly what it looks like. And he said, remember that when it seems like the clouds are not moving, they're always moving. You might not be able to see it for a long time, but the clouds are moving, and one of these days, the sun will shine again. And that same thing is true in grief. There will probably be times when we experience tremendous loss that we'll say, I don't think I'll ever get back again. Clouds are moving. One of these days, you'll be able to see the sun. Number two, he said we need to practice grieving on small things, and when we practice on small things, we'll be able to deal better with the large things when they come. Ever lose your car keys? And you really need them, you say, God, if you'll just let me find them this time, I promise you I'll try to be more careful the next time. That's part of grief, bargaining. So, that's an appropriate thing to do. I guess I've been practicing here lately. When I went to Fried Hardeman, I left my credit card at Longhorn Steakhouse in Mount Vernon. I found out about it in Kentucky when I pulled it out to pay for something and it wasn't there. Lost it. And then, one day we'd been on a trip. We went by Bud's Market where we buy our gasoline. Got back home, get my keys, get in the house. Don't have my keys. Where did I leave them? So practice grieving over the small things so we can do. Second book, an elder of the church introduced me to this book. We'd been friends for years, been at Fried Hardeman with him, and his wife died after a long battle with cancer. We were at the funeral and checked in on them from time to time, and one day, 6 months later, he called and said, "Jerry, it's been 6 months since Libby died. I thought I'd be over it by now, but I'm not. Could we talk?" And so for several weeks, we'd get together each week and talk. And he recommended to me a book called Tear Soup. He said, "Have you ever?" I said, "No, never heard of it before." But I got it and read it, and I've given many of these away. I call it a child's book for adults. See the big pictures and not much writing? That's my kind of book. I have a short attention span. And what it does is tells us a story about this woman who had a severe loss in her life. What was it? Don't know. Don't know if it's a husband or a child or, I don't know what it was. But she tells how she dealt with her loss. She tells about some people who were helpful and some people who were not helpful. Real good story. I call this the intellectual side of grief, and this is the emotional side of grief. And then at the end of the book, several pages on making tear soup. Grandy's cooking tips. If you are the cook. Then it says if your friend is the one who is making tear soup. Here's one of my favorite, soup making and time. Grief work takes time, much longer than anyone wants it to. If a child or spouse dies, it may be a year before the bereaved begins to gain a sense of stability because the loss is highlighted by each season, holiday, anniversary, or special day. So he said, first year is going to be tough. And then he adds this, the second year is not so great either. So if you're not over it in a year, don't think it's hopeless. Second year is not too great either. You may be okay 1 minute, but the next minute you may hit the bottom. And then some other comments. And then if the child is the cook, if you are a male chef, and then if two of you are cooking. Grief is unique to the individual. You may both experience the same loss, but you won't grieve in the same way. In other words, you're in it together, but you're in it alone. At first, you may feel closer to each other than ever before, but that may change the farther you get away from your shared loss. And then some suggestions on how to deal with that as a husband and wife. So one of the things we can do is to understand some of the process and try to be there and be helpful to the people who are involved. We need to be aware of people who are involved in losses other than death, such as divorce, moving, children leaving home, retirement, losing your house to a fire, storm, or foreclosure, leaving another church, leaving a life of sin. Did you know that people who leave a life of sin miss some of the things that they did while they were sinners? One of the interesting comments I heard is a man who said what he really missed was the bar after he became a Christian. He quit going to the bar, and he said, I don't miss the drinking. as much as I do as the companionship. In a bar, you can say anything good, bad, or ugly, and nobody's going to say you're going to hell. They'll listen to you and try to sympathize with you. He said, I find it difficult in church to share those ill-founded desires. Folks want to tell me where I'm going instead of listening to me and help me get through the difficult time. One of the things I've noticed in my ministry is the loss of position. When an elder dies or a preacher dies, their spouse not only loses their companion, but they lose their place of leadership. Well, we don't have she-elders. No, but you have wives of elders when you have elders, and you have wives of preachers. And much of their social and spiritual relationships were based around that relationship. And in one congregation, it was tough. Every time something was announced, his wife said, well, I never heard anything about that. What are they doing that? I hadn't heard anything about it. Of course you hadn't. You don't go to elders' meetings, and you don't have anybody living in your house who's going to elders' meetings. And so you're in the dark, just like everybody else is the rest of the time. And so we need to pay attention to that. Job, you're talking about grief. All his camels and all his donkeys, all his possessions, gone. And then all 10 children wiped away in a windstorm. Same day. I've been to a funeral where there were 3 caskets. I've never been to one with 10 in the same family. But the one with 3 was really sad. And Job had 10. And then the devil said, if you'll just let me touch him, and he was in sores from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And he scraped it with broken dishes. And 7 friends came to him, and for 7 days they sat there and didn't say anything. That was good. When they started talking, they messed it up. And they started saying, well, Joe, it's your fault. What have you done? You did something wrong. What have you sinned? Come on, fess up, fess up, fess up. And they pounded him and told him he's going to hell. Well, they probably didn't say it exactly like that, but it's your fault, your fault, your fault. And finally, he expresses some of his frustration in chapter 6, verses 11 through 14. They've told him over and over, you messed up, you messed up, you messed up, you messed up. Job says, what strength do I have that I should hope? And what is my end that I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones? Is my flesh bronze? You think I'm made out of metal? You think when you slap me it doesn't hurt? When you cut me I don't bleed? You're just pounding and pounding on me. Is my help not within me, and is success driven from me? Listen to verse 14. To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. He said, if you're really friends, you're not going to be ugly to people even if they've left the Lord. You're not going to try to hurt them worse. Kindness should be shown by a friend. The Good News Bible says, in trouble like this, I need loyal friends, whether I've forsaken God or not. I still need somebody who will be there and recognize my sorrow and cry with me. Jesus is my friend. He understands me when I'm sad. Isn't it good to have a friend like Jesus? If you hadn't been lately, today would be a good day to be sad for sin. If you're a Christian and have been forgiven of every sin, you may remember it, but you don't have to feel guilty because Jesus took it away when he died on the cross. If you've never become a Christian, part of the motivation to come to Jesus is to be sad because of sin and to repent because you believe in Jesus. Confess his name, be buried with him in baptism, be raised to walk in newness of life. And as we deal with our sorrow, we can help others deal with theirs. If you need to obey the gospel of Christ or come in any way, do that as we sing.